The wind was a wolf, howling down from the snow-dusted peaks, tearing at the thin blankets, finding every gap in the rough-spun fabric wrapped around Ayanna and her daughters. Ka, Shifra, and Liai, their faces pinched with cold, slept fitfully, tangled together like small, exhausted animals. Ayanna pulled them closer, her own body a shield against the relentless chill. The ache in her lower back was a constant, dull throb, a reminder of the life growing within her, a burden and a fragile hope in this unforgiving land. They had been on the run for days, driven from everything they knew, the specific cruelty that chased them a shadow she refused to name, focusing instead on the next sunrise, the next desperate step. Hunger gnawed, a sharp, familiar pain. The landscape offered only harsh rock and skeletal trees, mocking their need. Then, on the third day since the last meager meal, they saw the smoke. A thin, wavering plume against the vast, indifferent sky. Hope, a dangerous ember, flickered. It led them through the biting wind, over ground that bruised already aching feet, towards a small, solitary cabin huddled against the base of a sheer rock face. It looked as lonely and desolate as they felt. Hesitation warred with desperation. People could be cruel, judgmental, or worse. But the cold was absolute, a promise of death if they stayed out another night. Swallowing her fear, clutching her sleeping daughters, her belly heavy and demanding, Ayanna approached the cabin. The door was rough-hewn wood, the single window small and dark. No sound came from within. She raised a hand, knuckles raw from the journey, and knocked, the sound small against the wind's roar. Silence. She knocked again, a little louder, a little more insistent. Footsteps, heavy and slow, sounded from inside. The door creaked open a sliver. An eye, wary and shadowed, peered out. Then the door opened wider, revealing a man. Tall, gaunt, his face etched with lines that spoke of solitude and hard work. His hair and beard were grizzled, his clothes patched and worn. He held a rifle loosely in one hand, not aimed, but present. His eyes, a startling pale blue against his weathered skin, swept over Ayanna, over the small, sleeping forms huddled against her. He saw the tattered clothes, the hunger, the unmistakable curve of her belly. He saw the raw fear in her eyes, overlaid with fierce protectiveness. He said nothing. The wind swirled around them, pushing dust and biting cold into the small opening. Ayanna waited, holding her breath, bracing for rejection, for the door to slam shut, leaving them to the mercy of the elements. The man's gaze lingered on the children, then on her face. His expression was unreadable, a mask forged by loneliness and the harshness of his life. The silence stretched, thick with tension and unspoken histories. The wind howled again, a mournful, insistent sound. Finally, he lowered the rifle slightly. He didn't smile, didn't offer a word of welcome. He simply stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough and unused. The storm's coming. It wasn't an invitation. It was a stark statement of fact, of shared vulnerability against a common enemy. Ayanna didn't hesitate. Gathering her daughters close, she stepped across the threshold, into the dim, firelit interior, into a precarious, temporary safety. The air inside was warm, thick with the smell of wood smoke and something else she couldn't place. Felt like sanctuary, fragile as glass. The man closed the door softly behind them, shutting out the wolf wind and the world beyond. He gestured towards the small fire burning in the hearth. "Sit," he said. His name, she would later learn, was Thomas. Inside the cabin, the silence was different from the silence outside. It was heavy with unspoken questions and wary observation. Thomas didn't press them for information. He simply moved with quiet purpose, adding wood to the fire, bringing out a dented tin pot, offering them water from a bucket near the door. He watched Ayanna as she settled her daughters near the warmth, their small bodies thawing slowly. He saw the exhaustion that went bone deep, the way she held her belly, the subtle shift of weight that spoke of advanced pregnancy. He noted the triplets, how small they were, how they clung to their mother even in sleep. He didn't pry, And for that, Ayana was profoundly grateful. She knew his kind. Men forged by the solitude of the frontier, who valued practicality over idle talk. She knew, too, the judgment that could fall swift and heavy on a woman like her, alone with mixed-race children and another on the way. So she remained silent, offering only nods of thanks, her gaze fixed on the fire, on the faces of her daughters. Thomas eventually offered them food, dry jerky, tough but sustaining, and hardtack biscuits. It wasn't much, but to Ayana, it was a feast. She broke off small pieces for her daughters, coaxing them awake gently, watching them eat with a fierce, quiet satisfaction. She ate her own portion slowly, conserving energy, feeling the life inside her stir faintly. Thomas sat opposite them across the small cabin, mending a bridle strap by the light of a sputtering oil lamp. His presence was quiet, unobtrusive, yet she felt the weight of his observation. She began to watch him too, when she thought he wasn't looking. She saw the economy of his movements, the calloused hands, the quiet strength in his broad shoulders. She saw the loneliness etched around his eyes, the way his gaze sometimes drifted towards a photograph tucked into the corner of the mantelpiece. A woman's faded face, a ghost in the cabin. A wife, perhaps, gone? The thought sparked a faint flicker of understanding, a shared resonance of loss in the vast emptiness that surrounded them. Days bled into a week. The storm passed, replaced by biting cold and clear, blue skies. The rhythm of the cabin settled into a tentative truce between its occupants. Thomas went about his work, trapping, mending fences, chopping wood. Ayana cared for her daughters, sweeping the dirt floor, stretching their meager supplies of food. Dialogue was still sparse, limited to necessities. Water, more wood. They are hungry? But in the quiet shared space, something else began to grow. A fragile understanding, built on actions rather than words. He left extra water within her reach, brought back small game from his traps and shared it without comment, ensuring the girls had the choicest bits. She kept the fire stoked, neatened the small space, her presence a quiet, steady counterpoint to his solitude. The girls, initially shy, began to relax. They would watch Thomas from a distance, their wide eyes curious. Sometimes, he would carve small wooden figures by the firelight, simple shapes of animals, and leave them where the girls would find them. He never offered them directly, but they would appear as if by magic. These small, silent gestures were the stones upon which tentative trust was built. Ayana saw the kindness beneath his stoic exterior, the quiet respect he showed her. She began to breathe a little easier, though the fear that had driven them remained a cold knot in her stomach. The baby's movements grew stronger, more insistent. The time was drawing near. One evening, as she massaged her aching back, Thomas looked up from his work. His pale eyes met hers. He didn't ask about her situation, her past, or the danger she fled. He simply gestured towards her belly. Soon, he stated, not a question. Ayana met his gaze, and for the first time, she spoke more than a few words. Yes, she said, her voice low. Soon. The fragile peace was shattered without warning. It was mid-morning. Thomas was outside, repairing a section of the corral fence. Ayana was inside, tending to the girls, who were playing quietly by the fire with the small wooden figures Thomas had carved. Ayana felt it before she heard it, a tremor in the air, a distant rumble that grew rapidly into the unmistakable sound of horses approaching at speed. Not one or two, but several. Her heart leaped into her throat, a cold dread flooding her veins. She knew that sound. She knew what kind of men rode like that in this desolate country. She instinctively gathered her daughters, pulling them behind the large, rough-hewn table that served as the cabin's only significant piece of furniture. Thomas burst through the door, his face grim. He didn't need to say anything. His eyes, wide and alert, went straight to Ayana and the children. He grabbed his rifle, loading it swiftly. Get down, he barked, his voice sharp, urgent. And stay quiet, no matter what. He positioned himself by the window, peering out cautiously. The sound of the horses was louder now, closer, accompanied by rough shouts. Ayanna huddled with her daughters, her arms wrapped protectively around them, pressing their small bodies against her own, trying to shield her pregnant belly. The girls, sensing her fear, were wide-eyed but silent, clinging to her. The cabin door was suddenly kicked open with a violent crash. 3 men swaggered in, dust swirling around them. They were hard-faced, armed, their clothes stained and worn from the trail, their eyes alight with predatory intent. "Well now," the leader sneered, his gaze sweeping the small cabin. He saw Thomas by the window, the rifle in his hands. "Looks like old Tom's got company." His eyes flickered to the corner, catching a glimpse of movement. Ayanna's tattered skirt, a flash of color. His smile widened, showing rotten teeth. "And womenfolk, too. And what's this? Little ones." His voice was cruel, laced with mockery. Thomas stood his ground, rifle raised but not aimed directly. "You got no business here, Jess," he said, his voice steady despite the tension. "Turn around and ride out." The man, Jess, laughed, a harsh, grating sound. His companions fanned out, looking for anything of value. One spotted the faint outline of the photograph on the mantelpiece and knocked it to the floor, shattering the glass. Ayanna flinched, a silent protest. Jess's eyes, sharp and knowing, fixed on the table she hid behind. He took a step forward. "Heard you were hoarding something, Tom. Gold, maybe? Or maybe something else worth a man's trouble." His gaze dropped to her hiding place. "Like livestock." His implication was sickeningly clear. Thomas's jaw tightened. "There's nothing here for you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Just me and mine, yours." Jess scoffed. "Since when does old Tom take in strays? Looks like you've been busy since your wife passed on." He gestured towards the broken photograph with the toe of his boot. The casual cruelty, the disrespect for Thomas's loss, the blatant threat against Ayanna and her children. It was too much. Ayanna felt a surge of white-hot anger pierce through her fear. Huddled there, vulnerable, she knew they couldn't just wait for Thomas to handle this. She had to be ready. She scanned the small space around her, her mind racing, searching for anything she could use, anything that could make a difference. Her hand brushed against a stack of cut firewood piled near the hearth, waiting to be loaded. Solid, heavy pieces of oak and pine. An idea, desperate and dangerous, began to form in her mind. The confrontation hung in the air, thick and volatile. Jess took another step towards the table, his eyes fixed on Ayanna's hiding place, his smile ugly. Thomas shifted, raising his rifle slightly. "Get out," he repeated, his voice strained. Jess ignored him. "Come on out, squaw," he taunted. "Let's see what old Tom's been keeping warm." Ayanna felt the small, trembling bodies of her daughters against her. The fear was still there, a cold knot, but the anger had hardened into a fierce, protective resolve. She couldn't fight with a gun, couldn't face these men head-on. But she had strength, born of necessity and the land itself. Her hand closed around a thick piece of firewood, heavy and solid. One of the other outlaws, searching near the hearth, let out a grunt of disappointment. "Ain't nothing here, Jess. Just empty pots and dirt." The third outlaw was circling. His attention split between Thomas and the corner where Ayanna hid. He edged closer. This was her chance. As the third man reached the edge of the table, peering down, Ayanna sprang. Not graceful but explosive. She lunged forward, swinging the heavy piece of wood with all her might. Connected with the man's knee with a sickening crack. He roared in pain, stumbling back, clutching his leg. The sudden movement, the unexpected attack, drew the attention of the other two. Jess spun around, momentarily distracted from Thomas. That split second was all Thomas needed. He fired. The shot echoed deafeningly in the small cabin. Jess staggered back, clutching his shoulder, his cruel smile vanishing, replaced by shock and pain. The third outlaw, wounded, was still howling. The one who had searched the hearth drew a knife, looking wild-eyed between the injured Jess and the corner where the attack had come from. Anna didn't wait. She grabbed another piece of wood, heavier this time, and swung it low, aiming for the man with the knife. He dodged clumsily, but she was already moving again, pushing her daughters towards the back wall, away from the center of the chaos. The wounded outlaw with the knife lunged at her. Thomas, reloading quickly, fired again, the shot hitting the wall close to the attacker, making him hesitate. Jess, bleeding but enraged, drew his pistol. "You bitch!" he roared, aiming at Ayanna. But before he could fire, Thomas lunged across the small space, tackling Jess. They went down in a tangle of limbs and curses. The fight was brutal, desperate, confined to the tiny cabin. The outlaw with the knife, driven by pain and rage, came at Ayanna again. She couldn't run. She met his charge, swinging the heavy wood again, but he was faster this time, deflecting the blow with his arm. His knife flashed towards her. Then, a small, fierce shape darted out from behind her. It was Ka, the eldest of the triplets, no more than 5 years old, holding one of Thomas's small carving knives she must have found near the hearth. She didn't try to stab. She just threw it with surprising force. The small knife struck the outlaw's hand, causing him to cry out and drop his weapon. Thomas, wrestling with Jess, managed to land a brutal punch, stunning the outlaw leader. Seizing the opportunity, Thomas scrambled away, grabbing Jess's discarded pistol. The third outlaw was still incapacitated by his leg wound. The fight was over as quickly as it began. The two conscious outlaws, wounded and demoralized, stumbled towards the door, Jess supporting his bleeding arm, casting venomous glares back at the cabin. "This ain't over, Tom," Jess snarled before they disappeared outside. The sound of their horses retreating faded into the wind. Silence returned to the cabin, broken only by the ragged breathing of Thomas and Ayanna, and the whimpering of the children. Thomas stood, bruised and shaken, but alive. Ayanna knelt, pulling her daughters close, her own body trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. The cabin was a mess, broken glass, scattered belongings, the acrid smell of gunpowder. Thomas looked at Ayanna, at the wooden club still clutched in her hand, at Ka, who had bravely faced the attacker. He saw not a helpless woman, but a fierce protector, a force of nature. He saw the resilience that mirrored his own. A faint smile touched his lips, not of amusement, but of respect. The shared ordeal, the fight for their lives within these four walls, had forged a bond stronger than steel. He walked over to the mantelpiece, carefully picked up the broken photograph, and tucked it back into place. Then he turned to Ayanna, his eyes soft. "We need to clean this up," he said quietly. And he looked at her belly. "Get ready." In the aftermath, the cabin felt different. Scarred, yes, by the violence, but also sanctified by shared courage. Thomas moved slowly, his shoulder bruised where Jess had fallen on him. Ayanna, her body aching, helped sweep the broken glass and straighten the scattered items. Ka, Shifra, and Liai, though frightened, watched them with wide, trusting eyes. The fear lingered, a cold residue, but it was tempered by the exhilarating knowledge that they had faced the threat together and survived. Thomas looked at Ayanna, seeing the quiet strength in her movements, the unwavering focus on her children. He had lived alone for years, walled off by grief and the habits of solitude. He had offered shelter out of a raw, inarticulate sense of duty or perhaps a flicker of something deeper he hadn't acknowledged. But she had shown him a different kind of strength, one that didn't rely on guns or physical force alone, but on fierce love and an instinct for survival. He saw the warrior spirit beneath the vulnerability, the resilience of the earth itself mirrored in her. He found the small carving knife Ka had thrown and placed it gently back in its place, glancing at the child with a look of quiet wonder. The threat of the outlaws remained, a dark cloud on the horizon, but it no longer felt insurmountable. Not with this quiet, formidable woman and her daughters by his side. The days that followed were colored by anticipation. Ayanna's time was close. Thomas, though clearly unused to such matters, did what he could, building a screen for privacy, ensuring there was plenty of hot water. Ayanna felt a new kind of fear now, primal and ancient, but also a profound sense of purpose. She was not alone. When the labor began, it was long and hard. Thomas waited outside, helpless, listening to her cries, the quiet presence of the girls a steady anchor. And then, finally, came the sound of a newborn wail. A boy. Ayanna held him, exhausted but radiant. Her 4 daughters gathered around her, peering at their new brother with shy curiosity. Thomas was called in. He stood awkwardly, looking at the tiny, red-faced infant, then at Ayanna's tired but triumphant face. His gaze lingered on the circle of children around her, this sudden, vibrant life filling his previously empty cabin. He saw not strangers anymore, but family, not in the way he'd known it, but in a new, forged-in-hardship sense. He saw the future stretching ahead, different now, irrevocably changed. The solitude he had embraced for so long no longer seemed a comfort, but a cage. The resilience Ayanna embodied, the quiet determination that had brought her through the storm, across the land, and through the ordeal with the outlaws, resonated deep within him. She had come to him vulnerable, seeking shelter, but she had given him back something he hadn't realized he'd lost. Connection, purpose, a reason to defend not just his solitude, but a shared future. Life here in this harsh, beautiful land would still be difficult. The threat of the outlaws might return. There would be challenges unlike any he had faced alone. But looking at Ayanna, at her children, at the new life cradled in her arms, he knew they would face it together. The cabin, once a lonely refuge from the world, was now a home, filled with the murmur of children, the quiet strength of a woman who refused to break, and the silent promise of partnership. Resilience wasn't just about enduring. It was about finding the courage to connect, to build, to hope, even in the face of relentless hardship. And in that moment, watching Ayanna hold her child, surrounded by her other children, Thomas felt a quiet, unfamiliar sense of belonging bloom in his chest. They had survived the wolves outside and the demons within. Together, they might just build something new.